The dragons had been around for 30,000 years, and in all that time, not a single one had ever spoken a word to anyone. Not to humans, not to aliens, not to any of the thousands of species that had risen and fallen across the galaxy. They just existed, these massive creatures that shouldn't be possible according to every law of physics that anyone understood. Nobody knew where dragons came from originally. They just showed up one day in recorded history, and apparently they'd been around long before that too. Some dragons were absolutely enormous, big enough that you could see them from orbit, their bodies stretching across landscapes like living mountains. Others were smaller, though even the small ones were still the size of buildings. What really messed with people's heads was that dragons could fly through space without any kind of ship or protection. They'd just appear near a planet, wings spread across the stars, and somehow survive in the vacuum like it was nothing. Every civilization that reached the stars eventually encountered dragons. It was like a universal constant. You'd develop space travel, start exploring, and sooner or later you'd find a dragon just hanging out on some moon or drifting through an asteroid field. They came in all sorts of colors and shapes. Some had scales that looked like they were made of metal. Others seemed to be covered in something that shifted and changed like liquid light. Their eyes always glowed though, with this inner fire that made you feel like they were looking right through you into something deeper. The thing that drove everyone crazy was that dragons clearly weren't mindless animals. They were intelligent, obviously so. You could see it in the way they moved, the way they watched things. They paid attention to specific events. When two civilizations made first contact, dragons would show up to observe. When a massive battle was about to happen, you'd often spot dragons in the distance, just watching. When natural disasters struck planets, dragons would appear and witness the destruction without lifting a claw to help or hinder. The Ven were probably the most persistent in trying to communicate with dragons. The Ven were this species of scholarly types who valued knowledge above everything else. They spent centuries trying every method they could think of. They left offerings of precious metals and gems near dragons. They wrote out complex philosophical treatises and left them where dragons could see. They even built entire temples dedicated to dragons, hoping the creatures would appreciate the gesture and decide to talk. The dragons ignored all of it. They'd look at the offerings, maybe circle around the temples once or twice, and then go back to whatever mysterious business occupied their time. The Kordaks took a different approach. They were a warrior culture that believed strength was the only language that mattered. They saw dragons as the ultimate challenge, the greatest hunt in the galaxy. Kordak's warriors would track dragons across star systems and attack them with the most powerful weapons their civilization could produce. They fired missiles that could crack planets. They used energy beams hot enough to melt through starship hulls. They even tried experimental weapons that messed with the fundamental forces of reality. None of it worked. Dragon scales turned out to be tougher than any material science could explain. Weapons that should have vaporized them on contact just bounced off or fizzled out. The really weird part was that dragons almost never fought back. If you attacked one, it would usually just leave. It would spread its wings and vanish into space, reappearing somewhere else like you weren't worth the effort of responding to. There were rumors, though, whispered stories about hunters who pushed too far. Those hunters supposedly just disappeared. No bodies found, no wreckage, just gone like they'd been erased from existence. The Mindari were telepaths, a species that communicated primarily through direct mind-to-mind contact. They figured if anyone could crack the dragon mystery, it would be them. Their best telepaths meditated for years, preparing themselves to reach out to dragon minds. When they finally tried, they reported something disturbing. They could sense that dragons were thinking, that there was vast intelligence there, but they couldn't make contact. It was like trying to have a conversation with an ocean. You knew there was something immense and deep, but you couldn't find anything to hold on to, no thoughts or concepts that translated into anything comprehensible. Over 30,000 years, dragons became woven into the fabric of galactic culture. Hundreds of religions formed around them. Some species saw them as gods or angels, divine beings watching over creation. Others thought dragons were demons or harbingers of doom. There were cults that believed dragons were testing the younger races, and that someday they'd speak and share cosmic secrets. There were scientific organizations dedicated solely to studying dragons, trying to understand their biology and origin. Artists across countless worlds painted dragons, wrote songs about them, told stories trying to explain them. Parents would point out dragons to their children and tell them legends. Some accurate, most not. Dragons became symbols used in everything from military insignia to corporate logos. The irony was that despite being such a huge part of galactic consciousness, nobody actually knew anything real about them. The truth was that dragons operated by rules nobody understood, and maybe that was the point. They showed up for reasons that seemed random but probably weren't. A colony ship would be struggling with a crisis, and a dragon would appear to watch but never help. Two civilizations would be on the brink of war, and dragons would gather at the border like spectators at a sporting event. Scientists theorized that dragons were studying the younger races, gathering data for some unknowable purpose. But that was just guessing. Maybe dragons were ancient beyond understanding. Maybe they were visitors from another dimension. Maybe they were the last survivors of a long-dead civilization. Nobody knew, and the dragons weren't telling. People got used to it eventually. Dragons became just another part of life in the galaxy. Strange, mysterious, impossible to communicate with, but there. Always watching with those glowing eyes, never speaking, never explaining themselves. For 30,000 years, that's just how it was. Dragons were the universe's greatest mystery, and everyone had accepted that the mystery would never be solved. Then Tommy Miller happened, and everything changed. The first week on the moon was pure survival mode. Robert and Beth Miller had crash-landed on a world that wasn't supposed to exist according to their star charts, and they had an 8-month-old baby to keep alive. Their escape pod was damaged but functional enough to provide basic shelter. The environmental system still worked, barely, giving them breathable air inside and a place to sleep that wasn't completely exposed to the elements. The food situation was their biggest worry. They had emergency rations for maybe 2 weeks if they stretched them thin. After that, they'd need to figure out if anything on this strange moon was edible. The vegetation looked weird, nothing like Earth plants or even the alien crops they'd seen on other colony worlds. Everything had this faint bioluminescent glow to it, especially at night. Robert spent hours scanning plants with their damaged equipment, trying to figure out which ones might kill them and which ones might keep them alive. Water was easier, thankfully. There was a stream about 100 meters from the crash site. The pod's purification system still worked, so they could at least drink without worrying about alien bacteria or toxins. Small victories mattered when you were stranded with no rescue in sight. And through it all, the dragon watched. It had landed that third day and simply hadn't left. The creature maintained its distance, always staying about 100 meters away, but its attention never wavered. Those massive amber eyes tracked every movement the family made. When Robert went to gather water, the dragon's head would follow. When Beth sorted through their supplies, the dragon watched. When they moved Tommy from the pod to a makeshift outdoor play area they'd set up, the dragon's gaze followed the baby with particular intensity. It was unnerving at first. Robert kept expecting the dragon to do something, anything. Attack them, leave, make some kind of move. But it just observed with a focus that felt almost scientific. Like they were specimens in an experiment and the dragon was taking notes. Beth pointed out that at least the dragon's presence kept other potential threats away. They'd seen some flying creatures in the distance that looked predatory, but nothing came close while the dragon was there. Tommy, being 8 months old, had absolutely no concept of danger. While his parents were stressed and exhausted and worried, Tommy thought the dragon was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. Babies at that age are naturally curious about everything, but Tommy's interest in the dragon went beyond normal infant curiosity. It became an obsession. Whenever they brought Tommy outside, his eyes would immediately search for the dragon. When he found it, his whole face would light up with this huge gummy smile. He'd wave his little arms and kick his legs, making excited noises. At first, Robert and Beth thought it was cute in a weird way. Their son's first encounter with alien life, and he was treating it like a big friendly dog. But then they started noticing something odd. Tommy would babble at the dragon. All babies babble, making those nonsense sounds as they learn to control their vocal cords and experiment with making noises. It's completely normal. What wasn't normal was that Tommy's babbling changed when he was looking at the dragon. Beth was the first to notice it. She'd been a speech therapist before they'd signed up for the colony mission, so she paid attention to language development. When Tommy babbled at his parents or at his toys or just at nothing in particular, the sounds were random. Standard baby stuff. But when he babbled at the dragon, there were patterns. Certain sounds would repeat in sequences. He'd make a noise, wait as if expecting a response, then make another noise. It was almost like he was trying to have a conversation, using whatever tools his 8-month-old brain had available. Robert thought Beth was reading too much into it. Seeing patterns where there were none because they were isolated and stressed and looking for anything unusual to focus on. But Beth was sure. She started paying closer attention, even making notes. Tommy would look at the dragon and make specific sounds, almost like he was trying different combinations to see what worked. The dragon, for its part, seemed equally fascinated by Tommy. While it watched Robert and Beth with that scholarly intensity, its attention on Tommy was different. Softer, maybe. More focused. When Tommy babbled at it, the dragon's eyes would brighten slightly, the inner glow intensifying just a bit. Sometimes it would tilt its massive head to one side, a gesture that seemed almost quizzical. Weeks passed in this strange routine. Robert and Beth figured out which plants were safe to eat. They got better at rationing their supplies and using the pod systems efficiently. They took turns keeping watch at night and caring for Tommy during the day. And always, the dragon was there, watching. Tommy was developing fast, the way babies do. He was getting better at sitting up on his own. He'd started attempting to crawl, though he wasn't very good at it yet. And his babbling was becoming more complex, more intentional. Beth swore he was building a vocabulary, even if it wasn't any language that humans would recognize. Then one morning, everything changed. It was early, just after sunrise. The moon's sun was smaller than Earth's but brighter somehow, casting sharp shadows. Beth was feeding Tommy his breakfast, a mash made from their dwindling supply of baby food mixed with a local plant they determined was safe and nutritious. Tommy was in a good mood, smiling and making happy noises between bites. He suddenly stopped eating and turned to look at the dragon. His eyes locked onto those massive amber eyes, and he got very still. Beth felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Something was different. The air felt charged, like right before a thunderstorm. Tommy opened his mouth, and instead of his usual babbling, he made a very specific sound. Urkel. It wasn't quite like any sound he'd made before. It had weight to it, intention. He repeated it, louder this time. Urkel. His little arms reached toward the dragon, and he said it again. Urkel. Beth laughed, though it came out a bit shaky. Of course. Of course their son's first word would be some kind of baby talk nonsense directed at the giant space dragon. Not mama or dada like normal babies. No, Tommy Miller had to be unique even in this. She called out to Robert, who was working on the pod's communication system. Honey, Tommy just said his first word. Robert came over, wiping grease from his hands. Yeah? What did he say? Some baby gibberish at the dragon. Urkel or something like that. They both smiled, proud parents despite the insanity of their situation. Tommy said it again, his face scrunched up in concentration, trying hard to form the sound correctly. That's when the dragon moved. For the first time in 3 weeks, the dragon moved. It rose to its full height, and Robert and Beth were suddenly reminded of just how massive this creature was. 50 meters of muscle and scale and ancient power, moving with a grace that something so large shouldn't possess. Its wings unfurled slightly, catching the morning light and throwing copper and gold reflections across the clearing. Robert's instinct was to grab Tommy and run, but there was nowhere to go. Beth clutched her baby tighter, her heart hammering in her chest. The dragon took a step forward, then another. Each footfall made the ground tremble. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it was being careful not to startle them more than necessary. Then it lowered its enormous head until one eye was level with Tommy. That eye was bigger than the baby's entire body, glowing with that inner amber fire. Tommy didn't cry or show any fear. Instead, he laughed, a delighted baby giggle, and reached his tiny hands toward the dragon's snout. The dragon made a sound. It was deep, resonant, vibrating through their bones and teeth. And then it spoke. Actually spoke, forming words in Galactic Standard, the common language used for trade and communication across civilized space. The voice was unlike anything they'd ever heard. Ancient. Powerful. It sounded like mountains grinding together, like the echo of thunder in deep canyons, like wind howling through spaces that had existed since before life began. Uncle? One word. Just one word, but it changed everything. Beth's legs went weak. Robert made a sound that was half gasp, half laugh, like his brain couldn't process what was happening. The dragon had spoken. After 30,000 years of silence, a dragon had spoken, and its first word was uncle. The dragon pulled back slightly, its massive eye blinking. When it spoke again, there was wonder in that mountain-deep voice. You called me uncle. No human has ever, no one has ever. It trailed off, and for a creature of such immense size and obvious age, it suddenly seemed lost. Uncertain. Tommy, completely oblivious to the cosmic significance of the moment, squealed with delight and patted the dragon's nose with his pudgy little hand. The dragon's eye closed briefly, and when it opened again, there was something warm there. Something that looked almost like tears, though dragons probably didn't cry the way humans did. Over the next hour, while Robert and Beth sat in stunned silence, the dragon explained. It spoke slowly at first, like someone remembering how to use a language they hadn't practiced in a very long time. Its name was Pirith, which didn't translate perfectly into human languages but meant something like ancient fire that remembers. It was old. Impossibly old. It had been alive when Earth's dinosaurs were still walking around, and even that was recent history from its perspective. Pirith told them why dragons never spoke to the civilizations they observed. It wasn't because they were cruel or indifferent. It was because they couldn't. Dragons didn't communicate the way other species did. They didn't use words or sounds or even telepathy in the way that telepathic species understood it. Dragons shared consciousness directly. They opened their minds to each other and experienced each other's thoughts and feelings and memories as if they were their own. The problem was that this kind of communication required what Pirith called openness of being. Your mind had to be undefined, unrestricted by preconceptions or rigid thought patterns. You had to perceive reality without filters, without the layers of culture and language and expectation that every civilization wrapped around itself like armor. Adult minds couldn't do it. It didn't matter what species you were or how intelligent or how spiritually enlightened. Once your brain developed past a certain point, once you learned language and culture and started categorizing the world into concepts and categories, your mind became too closed. Too structured. Dragons could perceive these minds, could sense the intelligence behind them, but couldn't truly connect. It was like trying to have a conversation through a wall. You knew someone was on the other side, but you couldn't reach them. Infants were different. Baby brains were still forming, still open and undefined. They perceived reality directly without the filters that adults used. A baby didn't see a chair and think about all the concepts associated with chairs. They just saw shapes and colors and something to interact with. That openness, that direct perception, was closer to how dragons experienced reality. But even infant minds usually couldn't bridge the gap. The difference between a dragon's consciousness and any other species was just too vast. Dragons had tried, over millions of years. They'd observed countless civilizations and encountered countless babies of countless species. Nothing worked. The gap was too wide, the difference too fundamental. Except somehow, Tommy had done it. When he'd looked at Pirith and made that sound, Urkel, he hadn't just been babbling. He'd been reaching out, his undefined infant consciousness somehow making contact with something infinitely older and more complex. And he'd decided, in whatever way an 8-month-old baby decides things, that this ancient cosmic entity was Uncle. Pirith didn't understand how or why. The dragon had lived for millions of years and had never experienced anything like this. Tommy shouldn't have been able to do what he did. Human neural patterns weren't that different from other species that dragons had encountered. There was nothing special about human brain chemistry that would explain this breakthrough. Maybe it was just random chance. Maybe Tommy happened to have exactly the right combination of genetics and neural development at exactly the right moment. Maybe it was because he'd been in close proximity to Pirith for weeks, his developing brain adapting to the dragon's presence in ways that wouldn't have been possible if they'd met later. Maybe it was something else entirely, some factor that even Pirith's ancient intelligence couldn't identify. Whatever the reason, it had happened. Tommy had looked at Pirith and seen not a monster or a god or a mysterious entity. He'd seen family. He'd seen Uncle. That simple, innocent recognition, that immediate acceptance without fear or reverence or any of the baggage that adults brought to the encounter, had done what 30,000 years of careful study and deliberate attempts at communication had never accomplished. Pirith told them something else too, something that made the moment even more profound. The dragon had come to this moon to die. Not from injury or illness, but from something deeper. Dragons lived for millions of years, but that kind of lifespan came with a cost. When you live that long with no one to truly talk to, no genuine connections to forge, no real relationships to sustain you, you eventually just lost the will to continue. You chose to stop existing, to fade away into whatever came after. Pirith had been alone for longer than human civilization had existed. It had watched countless species rise and fall, had witnessed wonders and horrors beyond description, and had never been able to share any of it with anyone. The loneliness had become unbearable. So Pirith had come to this isolated moon to quietly stop being. Then a human family crashed nearby, and a human baby looked at ancient cosmic loneliness and called it Uncle. That simple act of recognition, that innocent gesture of connection, had given Pirith something it thought it had lost forever, a reason to keep existing. 3 months is a long time to be stranded on an uncharted moon with no communication and a baby to care for. Robert and Beth had almost given up hope of rescue. Their pod's long-range transmitter was fried, and they had no way to send out a distress signal that anyone would pick up. They'd settled into the idea that this strange moon might be their home for the rest of their lives. At least they had food now, and water, and surprisingly good company in the form of an ancient dragon who turned out to be an excellent conversationalist. When Beth's handheld scanner suddenly picked up a signal from an approaching ship, she almost didn't believe it. She checked it 3 times before shouting for Robert. A rescue vessel had finally traced their escape pod's trajectory through some miracle of math and persistence. They were saved. After 3 months of isolation, they were finally going home. Then the scanner showed something else. The rescue ship had detected Pirith. Beth watched in real time as the ship's trajectory changed, moving away from the moon. They were aborting the rescue. Standard protocol when dragons were present was to avoid contact, to not take risks. The rescue crew probably assumed that Robert, Beth, and Tommy were already dead, killed by the dragon shortly after landing. Beth felt panic rising in her chest. They'd been so close. She couldn't let the rescue ship leave, not after 3 months of waiting. She grabbed the pod's communication system, which was damaged but still had short-range capabilities. She started trying to hack into the rescue ship's comm channels, her fingers flying over the controls while Robert held Tommy and watched anxiously. It took her 20 minutes of frantic work, but she finally broke through their security. Her voice came through on the rescue ship's bridge, probably scaring the hell out of whoever was on duty. "Don't leave. Please don't leave. We're alive. The dragon isn't dangerous. Something impossible has happened here." There was a long pause. Then a woman's voice came back, cautious and professional. "This is Captain Jessica Hayes of the rescue vessel Meridian. Please identify yourself." "Beth Miller, colony transport survivor. My husband Robert and our son Tommy are here with me. We've been stranded for 3 months. The dragon you detected, it talks. It's been talking to us. Please, you have to land and see this." Another pause, longer this time. Beth could imagine the conversation happening on that bridge. The captain probably thought she'd lost her mind. Isolation and stress could do that to people. Dragons didn't talk. Everyone knew that. This was probably some kind of hallucination or desperate delusion. But Captain Hayes was apparently the kind of person who took calculated risks. Her voice came back firm and decisive. "We're coming down. But we're landing a kilometer away from your position and approaching on foot. If that dragon makes any aggressive moves, we're leaving immediately. Understood?" "Understood. Thank you. Thank you so much." The Meridian landed exactly 1 kilometer from the crash site, and Captain Hayes assembled a small team to approach on foot. She brought her security chief, a medical officer, and a xenobiologist who specialized in studying dragons from a very safe distance. They were all armed, though Hayes knew perfectly well that weapons were useless against dragons. It was more for psychological comfort than actual defense. The team moved slowly through the strange bioluminescent vegetation, weapons ready, every sense alert for danger. As they got closer to the crash site, they could hear something that made them all stop in their tracks. A voice, deep and resonant, speaking Galactic Standard. But it wasn't a human voice. It was something else entirely, something that made the ground vibrate slightly with each word. They crept forward until they could see into the clearing where the escape pod had crashed. What they saw would be talked about for the rest of their lives. The dragon was lying on its side in a relaxed position, its massive body taking up most of the clearing. Pressed up against its side, using the dragon as a pillow and completely asleep, was a human baby. The kid couldn't have been more than a year old, drooling slightly and snoring in that way that babies do. Robert and Beth were sitting nearby, looking healthy if a bit worn from their ordeal. And the dragon was talking to them. Actually talking, discussing something that sounded philosophical in nature. Captain Hayes caught fragments of the conversation as her team stood frozen in shock. "But you see," the dragon was saying in that mountain-deep voice, "humans assume that consciousness requires biological substrate. Your philosophers have debated for centuries whether artificial intelligence can truly be aware. Yet you've never considered that consciousness itself might be the fundamental substrate, and matter merely its expression." Robert was nodding, looking like he was having the time of his life despite being stranded on an alien moon. "So you're saying reality might be consciousness experiencing itself from different perspectives?" A crude simplification, but closer to truth than most theories your species has produced. Beth noticed the rescue team first. She jumped up with a huge smile, relief flooding her face. "Captain Hayes. Thank God you came." The dragon's massive head turned toward the newcomers, and 4 sets of human eyes met one enormous amber eye. Captain Hayes had been in space for 30 years. She'd seen combat, survived ship breaches, negotiated with hostile aliens, and once talked down a crew member who'd gone violently insane from jump sickness. She considered herself unflappable. She was absolutely flabbergasted. The dragon studied them for a moment, then spoke directly to the captain. "Greetings. I am Pirith. You need not fear me. I mean no harm to you or the family I have been protecting." Jessica Hayes had practiced first contact protocols extensively. She trained for meeting new alien species, for handling unexpected situations, for staying calm under pressure. Nothing in her training had covered what to do when a dragon spoke to you in perfect galactic standard while a human baby used it as a bed. Her security chief made a sound that might have been a whimper. The medical officer dropped his scanner. The xenobiologist looked like he might faint. Hayes cleared her throat and did her best to maintain some semblance of professional dignity. "I'm Captain Jessica Hayes. It's an honor to meet you, Pirith." What else could she say? The dragon had just casually shattered 30,000 years of established reality. Every xenobiology textbook would need to be rewritten. Every religion that had formed around dragons would need to reconsider its entire theology. The political implications alone would reshape galactic civilization. Tommy chose that moment to wake up. He yawned, stretched, and rolled over against Pirith's side. Then he noticed the new people and gave them a big gummy smile. "Unk," he said happily, patting the dragon's scales. "Unk?" "Yes, small one," Pirith said gently, the massive voice somehow conveying affection. "Uncle is here." Captain Hayes decided that when she got back to her ship, she was going to pour herself the largest drink that regulations would allow. Possibly several drinks. The news spread across the galaxy faster than anyone thought possible. A dragon had spoken. Not just spoken, but held actual conversations with humans about philosophy, history, and science. After 30,000 years of silence, the breakthrough everyone had given up hoping for had finally happened. And it had happened because a human baby looked at an ancient cosmic entity and decided it was family. Within days, every major news network across hundreds of worlds was covering the story. The footage of Captain Hayes' first encounter with Pirith went viral across the entire galaxy. Religious leaders from dozens of species declared it a miracle or a sign or the fulfillment of prophecy. Scientists were losing their minds trying to understand the implications. Politicians were scrambling to figure out what this meant for interstellar relations and power structures that had been stable for millennia. The Galactic Council called an emergency session. Representatives from every major civilization packed the assembly hall, all talking at once, all demanding answers that nobody had. The human ambassador, a woman named Patricia who'd been expecting a quiet career of minor trade negotiations, suddenly found herself at the center of the biggest political storm in recorded history. After weeks of intense debate and negotiation, an agreement was reached. Pirith would come to Earth. The dragon had expressed interest in meeting more humans, in studying the species that had produced the first being to ever truly communicate with dragons. The UN designated a large uninhabited area in northern Canada as Pirith's landing site. It was remote enough to avoid populated areas but accessible enough for researchers and diplomats. The day Pirith arrived on Earth was probably the most watched event in human history. Every news channel broadcast the dragon's descent through Earth's atmosphere. It looked like a falling star at first, but then those massive wings spread out and it glided down with impossible grace. When Pirith landed, the impact registered on seismographs around the world. Tommy was there, of course, now almost 2 years old. The moment Pirith landed, the kid squealed "Uncle," and tried to run toward the dragon. Beth had to hold him back while officials and scientists stood around looking nervous and excited and terrified all at once. What Pirith brought with it changed everything. The dragon had lived for millions of years and had been paying attention the whole time. It shared scientific knowledge that human physicists had been struggling with for decades. Concepts about quantum mechanics and space-time that current theories couldn't explain suddenly made sense when Pirith described them. The dragon explained physics from a perspective of someone who'd watched the universe evolve and had learned to navigate through dimensions that humans barely knew existed. Pirith also brought historical records. It had witnessed civilizations rise and fall, had seen species reach for the stars and sometimes make it and sometimes destroy themselves. It remembered extinct races whose ruins archaeologists had been puzzling over for centuries. The dragon could describe their cultures, their languages, what mistakes led to their downfall. It was like having a living library of everything that had ever happened in the galaxy. There were warnings too. Pirith knew about cosmic threats that most civilizations weren't aware of. Dangerous phenomena in deep space, regions where the laws of physics broke down in ways that could destroy ships or even planets. Patterns in stellar evolution that could predict which stars were about to go supernova centuries before it happened. This information was invaluable for the safety of every spacefaring species. But Pirith also came with a request, and it was surprisingly humble for a being of such immense power and age. The dragon needed humanity's help. Other dragons were starting to speak now, trying to communicate with the civilizations they'd been silently observing for millennia. But it was hard for them. They could form words, could speak in various languages, but the deeper connection, the consciousness sharing that came so naturally with Tommy, wasn't happening with adults of any species. Pirith asked humanity to study what Tommy had done. To figure out if there was a way to teach adults to open their minds the way infants naturally did. Dragons desperately wanted to connect, to truly communicate after millions of years of loneliness. But they needed help understanding how to bridge the gap between their way of perceiving reality and how other species thought. The response from Earth was immediate and enthusiastic. The UN established the Dragon Communication Institute with funding from virtually every nation on the planet. Beth and Robert Miller became founding members despite having zero formal scientific credentials. They'd spent months learning to understand Pirith's communication style, and that practical experience was more valuable than any degree. Tommy became the most studied child in human history, though everyone was very careful to make sure he still got to be a kid. Researchers observed him interacting with Pirith, trying to understand what made their connection possible. Brain scans showed unusual activity patterns when Tommy was talking with the dragon, neural pathways lighting up in ways that adult brains didn't replicate. The breakthrough came when researchers started working with other young children. It turned out kids under the age of about 5 could learn to communicate with dragons much more easily than adults. Their minds were still flexible enough, still undefined enough, to make those connections. Programs started worldwide to introduce dragons to human children in safe, supervised settings. Within a year, there were dozens of dragons on Earth, all working with human children to establish communication. It was beautiful and strange and sometimes chaotic. A 5-year-old named Kevin became best friends with a dragon named Starweaver and insisted on bringing it to show and tell at kindergarten. A girl named Lisa taught her dragon friend how to play hide and seek, which was hilarious because the dragon was 30 meters long and glowed in the dark. Other species watched what humanity was doing and started their own programs. The Mindari had a breakthrough when they realized that dragon consciousness sharing operated on a frequency similar to their telepathy but required a different approach. The Viridians, who communicated primarily through art and music, found they could connect with dragons through collaborative creation. Every species brought their own strengths to the challenge. Slowly, painfully, but steadily, the galaxy learned to talk to dragons. And dragons, after millions of years of silent observation, finally got to share everything they'd witnessed and learned. They weren't gods or monsters or mysterious cosmic entities. They were people. Ancient, powerful, strange people with their own personalities and opinions and quirks, but people nonetheless. Some dragons loved the attention and threw themselves into teaching and sharing knowledge. Others remained reserved, more comfortable observing than participating. A few decided they preferred solitude and went back to drifting through empty space. That was okay too. The important thing was that now it was a choice, not an inability to connect. Tommy Miller grew up famous as the child who spoke to dragons, but Pirith made sure he had as normal a childhood as possible. The dragon became a permanent part of the Miller family's life. Uncle Pirith, exactly as Tommy had named it. The dragon attended Tommy's birthday parties, helped with homework, told stories about ancient civilizations, and occasionally gave the kid rides on its back through the clouds. When Tommy was 7, he asked Pirith a question that had been bothering him. "Uncle, why didn't dragons talk before? Were you waiting for something?" Pirith settled down to Tommy's eye level, which it had gotten very good at over the years. "We were waiting for someone to see us not as gods or monsters or mysteries, but as family. You looked at me and saw an uncle. That innocence, that immediate acceptance without fear or worship or confusion, it broke through walls we'd built over millions of years. Walls we didn't even know we'd built until you showed us they were there."